Pleasure to see you here. For those coming in, there are some seats down here. If that's too many steps, there are still seats in the middle. If you're in a very giving mood and you're on the edge, you could scoot in. We're having a good crowd today as we are halfway through, or obviously 7 months is past halfway, through the semi-quincentennial. And today, I've been thinking about this day from the beginning when we started really planning this a year ago, a little more than a year ago. Again, there's seats in the front, there's seats in the middle. Feel free to just please move and take one and grab one of those. Come on down and join me and Mr. Madison. We're down here. It'll be a lot of fun. I am Dr. Carl Kriesman. I am the Assistant Dean for History of Valencia College. It has been my privilege to work with the Winter Park Library since 2017 and giving public lectures on history. And it's been a joy just to partner with them. I'm based at the Winter Park campus, which is just right over there. I think it's that direction. And we would love to have you come visit us sometime or send some loved one to do classes with us. We typically at the library have 2 series that we balance. And as we rolled into this year, we decided to spend the entire year looking at the anniversary. As I have said before, I'll try not to say that phrase again because not all of you have been here. The semi-quincentennial is not linked only to July 4th. In fact, as we're going to see, July 4th is actually an inconsequential day. It's only important to us now because that's the date the printer printed it on, so we put that date on the printing. As we'll see as we get there, kind of a thing. So the revolution is going to have to be borne out over a series of years. And some historians would argue not until we get the Constitution, which is our second government. So if you come later this year, I'm going to show you some slides later, we're going to look at our first government. That's going to come into the conversation we're going to have here today. Certainly on the battlefield, not to Yorktown. So if we're still doing these in 2031, I'll probably do or have one of my friends who's a military historian expert come and do a talk on the Yorktown campaign. So we're kind of walking our way through. We want to use this entire year to really focus in on either date-specific things. So next month, Professor Salma is going to do a talk on the New York campaign that Washington managed and mostly lost, and sort of walk our way through kind of that relationship. Later, he's going to come back in the year. We're going to do a look at slavery in the Revolution and kind of the role of African Americans, their kind of story. I'm going to do a talk later on Ben Franklin. Anyway, that's all coming. We're still kind of working our way through. And we're already planning for next year. So yes, next year we are definitely going to do the semi-quincentennial on the Battle of Saratoga. So we'll have the whole Saratoga campaign in the summer when it basically happened, in a short version kind of a thing. So, but today I've been most excited about it because obviously everything hinges around this. I've already been asked, how could you say it changed the world? There's reasons to say the Declaration is, in one sense, a failed document at what it purported to do, in the sense that the charges that it make cannot hold up to scrutiny. Any good lawyer could have gotten almost all of them kicked out of court for being incorrect. Not inaccurate in the sense, did it happen? But as we'll see later, in the sense of saying, is it a fair charge to make? Which we'll walk our way through that when we're reading together in the process. But at the same time, the enduring part of the Declaration is actually not the latter 2/3, but the first third. And so we'll talk more about that as we kind of walk our way through. I will say, and I'll probably repeat it when I get there, what has excited me about today is that, unlike all the other times, if I plan it right, if I pull this off, there'll be a lot less of me and a lot more of you guys, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to help me read through the entire document. And so I've got it on the slides. I'm going to have a microphone. When it comes to you, you'll read what's on the slide. If you're like, I don't want to read, then just pass the microphone to somebody else. It's totally fine. Again, as you're coming in, there are lots of seats down here in the front, typical classroom behavior. Everybody takes the top seats. If you're on the edge and you're willing and you can slide in, slide in. Maybe we'll get the library to bring some more chairs up there in the back if we need to. But we're glad you're here. Please come on in, walk your way all the way down. There's a nice, good view down here in the front with me. So when we get to the reading, hopefully in a few minutes, we'll be reading our way through. I'll be stopping at different points to explain or share some things. I've given some of you, the DR graciously gave me some copies of the Declaration to bring. Some of you have your own. But we're going to read from up here, which it is taken directly from the National Archives, so pretty sure it's right. We'll walk our way through. So we're going to start with my favorite, of course, We've been working our way through really the whole year, but if we do 1 year, we looked at the road to the revolution, and 1 year, 1 month, and then another month, which I think was last month, we looked at Thomas Jefferson and his role kind of leading up. So this is really the sort of end of kind of a 3-part. If, by the way, you go, oh, I wish I'd heard those, all of those are available on my YouTube channel. I'd love to tell you how to get there. There'll be a QR code at the end that'll link you there at the very end of the session. You can kind of get your way through. I want to point out something to you because this is lost on most people. Most people would say we celebrate July 4th because of the Declaration, but actually what you should be celebrating on the 4th is that a resolution was passed, not the Declaration. The Declaration was declaring the causes which have impelled us to this revolution. The resolution, though, is the core point. Now you may go, what? So we'll get there in a second, but it's kind of interesting thinking how, as we go along 250 years, we can end up having, not mythical, but a loose or light hold on the actual historical data of what we should be trying to understand. And that's what we're going to try to walk our way through. I want you to know about both the resolution and the Declaration. We're going to read both of those documents as we kind of walk our way through. So let's get there. So 1776, there's been a lot of things going on. Again, the road to revolution, if you ask Adam, starts in 61. Typically when we teach our students, we start in 63 with the Proclamation Act. 61 is when the Otis family made their first big charge, lost a major lawsuit. It was kind of this big thing in Boston. Then the stand back in 65 kind of walked your way through. When we start the year, about 20,000 American militia people have besieged the city of Boston, which somewhere around 8,000 or so British soldiers are holed up, coming on the heels of Lexington and Concord. The Battle of Bunker Hill has already been fought. The Second Continental Congress is already in motion. They're kind of trying to figure things out. They've been meeting actually since May, so they're kind of talking about what they're doing, and slowly but surely they're taking on the role of governance as they kind of walk their way through. In the fall of the year, the king gave his annual opening speech before Parliament, and he admitted what was obviously true on the ground. There is an avowed and open revolution happening. So it shouldn't be that he's a bad guy for saying that. We'll find out later that some of the Americans didn't like it, but nonetheless he said the people have been misled. Actually, I would say that's probably true because it's true today. You all know that's the story, that a few people say a few things, post a few things, and the rest of us who weren't there kind of like, oh, really? That's terrible. And then we kind of get riled up and move in different directions. So the king's making this argument. He's probably accurate in the sense that, as we typically say, although demographic numbers are impossible to come by, when we read newspapers, read letters, read diaries, roughly 20 to 30% of the citizens were hardcore revolutionaries. Certainly by 76, post Thomas Paine's Common Sense, a good 20%, maybe 25% were hardcore in love with their country. So they were called loyalists. Remember, the American Revolution is really our first Civil War, or it's the fourth British Civil War, depends on how you want to count it, because they, up until 75, even 74, 75, they were all British citizens. They said it openly, they defended it. In fact, the entire argument that's being made up till this document is one that says basically to England, hey y'all, we're British citizens and we have a series of rights given us by our Bill of Rights of our government, written in the 1680s, and you're breaking them, so bad. But why are you bad? Because you're breaking our rights. What rights? Rights that we have as what? British citizens. So that's one thing we need to pay attention when we read the Declaration, is that this is really this moment when there's a shift beginning to happen. But so then you've got, as is always the case, it's true today, there's this middle group that's kind of like, yeah, I don't really know, I'm not really sure, don't really care. Kind of argue. I've just started describing it where there's kind of a moderate rebel and a moderate loyalist. They're not really hedging their bets. They're just kind of not certain they want to get involved. It's going to be pricey. It's going to be dicey. I don't know where I want to go in. Meanwhile, common sense, the Prohibitory Act, so the Prohibitory Act, from John Adams' point of view, is basically a declaration of war. But it's the government saying to the rebels, we're going to cause you financial pain. Because if the king's position is correct, and if my numbers are roughly correct, you could say there's 75% of the citizens who could be persuaded to stay loyal to the government. That's the argument being made. So they think we'll use financial pressure. We could have warned them, if you pay attention to any kind of world history and look particularly at warfares that try to use financial pressure on countries, that never works. It has never worked in human history. People will starve to death when they're besieged in a city rather than surrender. So we don't seem to learn this lesson historically. Anyway, they keep moving their way. In March, Washington successfully is able to threaten Boston so that the then acting General Howe gets out, takes everybody with him. Congress is beginning to make moves to kind of connect with other nations. They're starting to think about government. So Adams is asked to write his thoughts out, write his thoughts on government. It's a document every one of you should read if you're interested in kind of the founder's view about government. Everybody reads Montesquieu and Rousseau and Locke. Don't read those guys. They're not Americans. Read John Adams. Go read Thoughts on Government. It's brilliant. We've talked about it before. They try to get Canada to join in. We'll come back to Canada later. That doesn't work. Canada's not interested. So they're building momentum to May 10th. On May 10th, John Adams puts forth a resolution, which I'll come back. He's accused of this being something to do with independence, and he goes, yeah, this is independence itself. This is why the May 15th date, if you ask John, was often the date he was thinking, certainly when he and Jefferson had parted ways and were no longer friends, that's the day we should celebrate. Now, he'll say later, July 2nd, so, John's dealing a little bit with some sour grapes when he's making these ideas. But why May? Well, because this is the day we passed this resolution. What was the resolution? That we should assume all powers of government to secure, quote, the happiness and safety of their constituents. Now, I'll remind you, we've all been brought up to understand that when we say the word state, we think of it as a small part of a contiguous whole thing. So, to some degree, insignificant. Historically, that's incorrect. State is a synonym for empire, kingdom, nation. It's a word that was used to mean an independent, sovereign, civic entity of some size. So Luxembourg is a state. Belgium is a state, roughly the same size as Pennsylvania is a state. So in their minds, and you need to pay attention as we go through this, there's going to be a lot of plural words. So they're saying these states. They mean these independent nations are doing what? So they're saying to the 13 independent states, they're saying you should declare yourselves independent. We, the assembled, think this is the step you need to take. When it passes, it's monumental, and they will take it and they will begin to run with it and act with it. The first one to do, I'll come back here, is Virginia. Virginia does it actually on the same day. So probably they didn't wait to hear from Congress. They just decided they were going to send their representatives. If you're a North Carolina citizen, you know one of your phrases is first in freedom, and that comes from the fact that they actually voted, they told their representatives similarly before the May 15th date, but nobody in Philadelphia heard about that. So North Carolina was just a little slow. And you can see he kind of gets excited about it, and he writes his friend James Warren that Congress had passed the most important resolution that was ever taken in America. I love John. He's given to hyperbole. And so enthusiasm. So he'll have in a whole series, as I just showed you the first quote, a lot of most important. So he's kind of excited about it. The enthusiasm in the room will then lead, along with the May 15th decision, for Richard Henry Lee in June to put forth the resolution that the first quote that I showed you was championing. A resolution was passed. The vote on July 2nd that passes something technically was not passing the declaration, it was passing the resolution. What's the resolution? Well, here it is. That these united colonies, notice this shift here, what are they now? They're colonies, are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, meaning they go from kind of a subset of a system. To use a modern example, would be as if we're saying, Puerto Rico is just a territory, but it should go and become a free and independent nation, right? That'd be the same sort of political conversation that's happening here. Free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain, notice what is Great Britain? A state. So there again, you can see this. It's really important, particularly as you keep studying American history. I'm not trying to make a statement one way or the other, but when you look at what was some of the aspects of what was happening in 1850 to 1861, that's part of the argument. That's part of what's going on. What did we agree to do at the beginning? To be free and independent states. not states meaning little pieces of one big whole, but independent operation. When we talk about, we won't talk about the Constitution this year, but in another month we talk about what they wrote, the articles, and we'll allude at that moment to the Constitution. The entire argument about the Constitution were literally rock stars of the Revolution going, whoa, 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 where do you think you're going, Madison? That's some crazy talk, Hamilton. You can't go there because you're moving away from us as free and independent states into some subset of a larger whole. And then the whole argument that they're having at that time relative like, well, yeah, but do you want to be a successful collective? And that's a conversation we'll save for then, but that's kind of what's being argued. Ought to be totally dissolved. Dun, dun, dun. That's the resolution. It was quite explosive. Notice our boy Jefferson had been away. He had some things happening in his life, lost some people, was always thinking about Virginia first, and this is not to pick on Jefferson, but just to say he represents basically everybody, except people like George Washington and John Adams were already at this point beginning to see the larger whole thing as an entity, like these United States, like that being a thing. But most everybody else reflected Jefferson. He wrote from, well, I won't tell you where he wrote it, but he says, it's so distressing to be so far away from our native soil. Now, if you wrote that, we would assume you're visiting France, or maybe you've gone to China, or maybe you're somewhere else. But if you wrote it even in Hawaii, you wouldn't say you're away from your native soil because you know you're still in the United States, right? He was in Philadelphia when he wrote that because Pennsylvania was a foreign nation, a foreign land to him away from his native soil, right? So there they're going to get into an argument because they begin to debate it like you do with resolutions. We put this forth, put it out for a resolution, and the argument began. All the middle colonies, South Carolina, Georgia, they were all opposed to this. Now, that's not to say they were opposed to independence itself or even the step of independence. However, it is to say that many of them were thinking, while I wish to have maybe our rights resecured, I wish to have the standard of relationship that we had before, at least in their own imaginations, their imaginatory view of what the relationship was is false historically. It just doesn't hold up. But in their minds, it was what was happening. And they're like, I want that back. But do I want to go to independence? I'm going to have to fight for that. They're not just going to give it to us. Well, I don't think so. So again, there's a long argument happening. You can see Jefferson noted that, Maryland and South Carolina as example were not yet matured for falling from the parent stem. So this is why they will postpone the vote. They could have won the vote, probably 7-5, and it passes, right? Robert's Rule of Order. But they were aware at this point, if we're going to do this, we better try to be united. We already know we're not united because you've got this 25% as well as the kind of moderate loyalists who probably will not participate. And just so you know, to my point of this being a civil war, there are arguably more regiments formed of loyalist troops than of patriot troops. Washington consistently complained, I don't have enough troops. Well, not that they had all the troops, because they couldn't get a lot either, and the British will be consistently disappointed in the willingness of the loyalists to bear the hard cost of a battlefront consistently. They might be happy to cheer for the king's troops when they show up and give them some food, but then they don't want to have to be fighting a war. Neither would I. So there's some challenges, but still the point is they're not united, but they were saying to themselves, we better be united in this room. If we can't be united in this room, then the whole thing is up. So even though it's going to pass 7-5, probably is not good enough. So they say, let's postpone. And one of the main arguments that's made is that they don't have a governing plan. Like, what are we going to do? Are we really going to be 13 independent nations? Well, okay, but that doesn't seem wise. So they said, we'll form 3 committees, as you can see them there, and they'll get to work doing the work. So when we come back later this year, I forget which month it is, we will look and see what they did for their governing document. It's really an important document, which usually gets blown off or kind of aligned or slandered to some degree by people who are fans of the Constitution. Typically, the Constitution was great. They had that terrible document, and it was just a trial balloon, and it was a terrible idea. False. It was exactly what they wanted it to be. Might not have been good to be a united country under it. That's a different conversation. So they go to work. as you know, Jefferson is put on the committee along with Adams, Franklin, and these two guys, Robert Sherman, Robert Livingston. They didn't really do much. Livingston's the youngest, so he probably wasn't expected to do much. Jefferson is tasked to be the draftsman. He's the draftsman. Please do me the favor of never, ever, ever, ever again in your life ever calling Thomas Jefferson the author of the Declaration. He's not the author. He is the first draftsman. As we'll see, it's even going to get deeper than that. So he goes about a block. If you've been to Independence Hall, you know where it is. Seen some of the videos. Down the way this way is now a wonderful museum. You know, right over there behind us at this quadrant is where the Liberty Bell sits. If we're looking at Independence Hall, everybody with me? Some of you have been there. You just go up the street about a block. That's where Jefferson was. So he goes there and he starts writing. He starts drafting. Now, why was he chosen? Short answer, he's the best writer. From the moment he gets into governance at all in his mid-20s in Virginia, he's perceived as the best writer. He'd been the principal draftsman on a series of acts and declarations. He wrote his kind of magnum opus at the time, and my brain is totally blank on it, that the Summary Review in 74. And when he got to Philadelphia, people were like, oh, there's the famous Mr. Jefferson. And like the next day that he got there in 75, they were working on something. They're like, hey, Jefferson, you're on this committee. Why? We want your pen. Because he was a brilliant writer. He and Adams, as I said, they'll part ways. There's some reasons they go in different directions. Short version is that will then cause both of them to have to answer questions for about 30 years about the Declaration and its stance. And so Jefferson typically was so frustrated having to answer the questions. He's like, why did they just have me write it? I don't want to talk about it. Adams gave a much more lengthy position about how I could have, but I didn't want to, and knew you were better. Adams was on like 25 committees. He had no time to do this. So it was really just Jefferson's the best writer. Let's let him do it. So he does. He begins to write it. In 25, he talks about what he was doing. He said, look, we weren't trying to set out new principles or new arguments, never seen before, never say things which had never been said before. Instead, we wanted to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent and to justify ourselves in the independent stand we were compelled to take. So nothing necessarily original. This is a key part of like we get into. This is not demeaning him. In other words, he's writing things that people would have themselves said and believed. And when you look at kind of his process and his sources, he had a variety of sources that he leaned on, which is good, and he's going to take them and craft them together, come up with phrases that are beautiful in the writings. You can see lots of different people that he could have leaned into, probably did read. At this very moment, because of what had happened in May, Virginia was writing its own constitution. Because it was writing its own constitution, he himself was drafting ideas for the Constitution. So he's thinking about how would I do governance. He would always start with what we would call like a Bill of Rights statement. So the same sort of sentiment that he would have had, that he does have at the beginning of the Declaration. Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights may have had the strongest influence. Just as an example, you can see some. This is Mason. This is Jefferson. So you can see a real, commonality between some of the things that are being said: enjoyment, life, and liberty. Again, not unique. There are other people who are writing saying this idea. They're all quoting Locke largely. And Locke saying that the human has a right to life, liberty, and property. And they're not using property for a variety of different reasons, but the short version would be, particularly for Virginians, property was the pursuit of happiness. Pursuit of happiness meant getting property, so use a little code word there, kind of a thing. Here's another one, that all powers vested in the people, derived from the just powers from the consent of the governed. Here's another one. When government should be found inadequate, the majority has a right to reform, alter, or abolish it. They have a right to alter or abolish it. Again, we're not saying anything relative to like, oh, Jefferson plagiarized. I mean, it's an easy thing to say. It's funny, particularly with Locke. But he's just leaning on the documents and the ideas of the time. He finishes writing it. Now, Matt, when you look at Mason's, read Mason's. Mason takes off from there and goes into governance. Again, that's important for Thomas, but that's not our purpose today. He finishes writing it somewhere on the 23rd or the 24th of June. It takes it to John. He sends it to Ben. So this picture here, I'll come back. This is false because they were never in the room together talking about it. Right? So he goes to see John, who he says, I wanted to see these two judgments and amendments. I wished most to have the benefit. It seems that the other two guys do eventually get to see a draft copy. There's several draft copies along the way. But nonetheless, he wants to see, what does Franklin say? What does Adams say? Adams was very impressed. Again, it's not hard to be impressed, particularly when you read the preamble. You can see that he thought it had high tone and flights of oratory. Then he gets into the meat of it, and he's like, not so sure I would use some of these phrases. And ultimately, he makes some vocabulary suggestions. He was very supportive of one of the charges against the king, which we will not read because we're going to read the final edited version of which slavery is accused. Largely gets taken out because everybody's embarrassed. Like, dude, 1619, that's a long time before King George III. I mean, let's not talk about slavery. We just as soon leave it alone so we don't have an embarrassment, particularly from South Carolina and Georgia. I think it's in Thomas Jefferson's credit that he tried, and it's one of the 3 or 4 different times we looked at last time we did the talk on him, in which he was trying in some way to try to minimize slavery in Virginia. So there's several different editing, none that really stand out from Adams. Franklin has a few more big ones. So we hold these truths to be self-evident. That's a Franklin phrase. That's not a Jefferson phrase. Jefferson said we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. Franklin's like, too religious, dude, can't go there. So he wanted to pull as kind of much of any religious tones out of it as possible. You can see he edits a few other phrases, which we're going to look at some in a minute, but Jefferson had used, there's a deluge us in blood kind of thing about military, and Ben's like, that's too much. Invade and destroy us. Although destroy us, they deluge us in blood. It's really, you're still kind of frustrated. And together, Adams and Franklin make somewhere between 25 and 30 edits. And Jefferson takes those and goes back with Franklin and Adams' thoughts and writes what will be a final edited copy prior to going to the committee. This is when he makes one of his most significant changes, is that he had written in one of the charges that he had incited treasonable insurrections amongst our fellow subjects. Here, fellow subjects. And this was just a recent discovery by the archives in the country, the National Archives. And then he's like, no, we're going to change this to fellow citizens. So it's a real interesting concept relative to citizenship. We've talked about that before here as well. He's trying again to kind of move away. The whole document is trying to move away from a sense of we owe allegiance to a sovereign. So if you owe allegiance to a sovereign, you're a subject. And you say, no, we're claiming ourselves as states, so let's go there in that process. So then on June 28th, it's given to Congress. They wait till July 1st to have the debate, give everybody time to read it, kind of see what they want to come up with, their arguments. Leading the charge against it is John Dickinson. I love how Dickinson, you can see he's reluctant. Just so you know, Dickinson's already worked with Jefferson on some key resolutions in late 75. Dickinson is the lead person who's working on the committee to create what will be the Articles of Confederation. So he's not like some kind of a loyalist in the sense of I hate all this. He just thought, this is the wrong time. This is not wise. We'll probably lose. Let's see if there's another pathway. And you can see, I love this quote, that he thought, my opposition will give finishing blow to my once great popularity. And indeed, when it's over, he will eventually move from Pennsylvania to Delaware. He will fight in the Revolutionary Army. So he's not not going to participate. He'll participate far more in one sense than Jefferson himself did. But he gets up and makes an argument, roughly about an hour. And in the point, he's kind of saying, look, this is like if we made a boat out of paper and we put it to sea. You make a boat out of paper, you're not going to make it. He finishes. Storm clouds are rolling in. There begins to be a thunderstorm outside the windows in Pennsylvania. Everybody starts looking at Jefferson. Jefferson's not saying anything. Then everybody starts looking at Adams. Adams isn't saying anything. Everybody's sitting there. Adams is sort of looking around the room wondering if anybody else is going to get up and speak. They will eventually. They'll debate this for about 9 hours. But in the process, finally, Adams will be the person who rises to his feet and begin to go moment by moment, historical moment by historical moment, to make the argument as to why we've gotten here and why this is a fair and correct thing to do. This is why we need to make this moment. As you can see, many of his peers thought it was magnificent. I've made this point before. We need Washington to win on the battlefield. The death of Washington would have been probably a blow we could not have survived, but we need John Adams. If we're going to have faces on Mount Rushmore, it should have been Adams. We don't have a nation without John Adams. Period. Full stop. So Adams wins the argument, but not before repeating the whole thing. In fact, what happened is, so the various states themselves are having their own ongoing arguments. In New York, which is very loyalist, there are revolutionaries who are saying, we need to do this, and Albany's going, no, we're not going to do this. When the British will show up on July 2nd, they'll be greeted by scores of loyalists going, oh my God, thank goodness you're here, giving them food and ammunition and support and information, because our nation's troops have come to protect us from this wild, vagabond group of crazy people led by that idiot George Washington. So they're not interested in this kind of a thing. And so, for instance, New Jersey, which is a middle colony, had up to this point basically been on the side of moderate loyalists. And somewhere before the summer, they had recalled their guys and said, come home, we're replacing you. Because revolutionaries in the New Jersey parliament or government, Congress, had said, hey, we're going to send new representatives who will vote for it. So some of them walk in while John is speaking, so they didn't hear the whole thing. John sits down, thunderstorm is kind of going now, everybody's feeling the solemnity of it, kind of like, ooh, wow, what are we going to do? And they're like, would you like to hear the rest of it? And everybody's like, that kind of stuff. And eventually, one of the loyalists looks over to Adams and says, look, you're the one who knows the whole story the best. So John gets back up on his feet, makes all of Dickinson's points for him, kind of always looking at John, is that right? And John Dickinson's going, yep, that's good. And he's making the points, then he makes all of his points again. He was on his feet for roughly 3 hours. I promise our talk will not be that long. And eventually the vote. The vote did not go the way they wanted, because it went 9-3-1. Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Delaware all vote no. Now to be fair, Delaware voted 1-1, but in a rules of order system, a tie vote's a no vote. So they didn't vote for it. Now again, it passed. They should have said, cool, the resolution passed, let's go for it. But as I said, you could tell they wanted to try to find for unanimity. So they break, they go home. They're like, I'm not sure. But again, they've been debating all day. Later that night, they get word that the fleet has arrived in Manhattan. Like, oh no, okay, it's serious now. We're really going to do this. Arguably, they could have come back the next day and all voted no, because the sense of this is the level to which the government is determined to hold on to their land, their citizens, their people. Instead, something else happened. When they came back the next day, Dickinson and his friend Robert Morris, who were both on the no vote side for Pennsylvania, did not show up. We don't know if there was any kind of negative conversation. More than likely there was some conversation. And Dickinson, seeing the handwriting on the wall, recognized we need to be unanimous, so we should do that. I just can't vote against. I can't vote that way. So their vote goes from 4-3 against to 3-2 in favor, and Pennsylvania shifts. When Pennsylvania shifts, South Carolina shifts, and then at the sort of last minute, it's kind of these famous stories with the Declaration, a man comes bursting into the room all mud-splattered. His name's Caesar Rodney. He's from Delaware. He had ridden 80 miles, knowing or having heard there's a vote, that the vote is happening. So he's ridden 80 miles all night long, about 4 or 5 different horses, arrived and said, I vote for independence. So Delaware's vote shifted to 2-1 in favor. Leaving New York. New York will still abstain because they're saying, we've not been told anything, but they're like, we're with you. And so that's why you have New York names signed on the Declaration, because they were saying, we're in, we're going to do this in the process. And so July 2nd, if Adams can't have you celebrating on May 5th, then July 2nd is the day we should celebrate, because that's the date the resolution was passed. That's why on July 3rd, he writes to his wife saying, yesterday, the most important resolution was passed without any dissension. He's kind of ignoring New York. And you will read soon a declaration telling of the causes. But it's not the end for our purposes, because now they go into the committee of the whole, in which they need to then debate and make edits. The committee of the whole, Robert's Rules of Order, so everybody in the room now is part of the committee. They begin the process of kind of digging into it. They make these different edits that have made. As I already told you, the slavery statement is eradicated. Most all of the changes then will be wording only. There are no other statements that Jefferson and the committee had written that are fully taken out. There's a series of edits that kind of work their way through. Let me show you some of these before we read it ourselves. So here's one. This is what the committee wrote, right, about the history present of the King of Great Britain. You can see this kind of goes on and on and on and on and on. And they're like, yeah, we don't need to say all that. Even this here at the end, to prove this, fact we submitted to Canon World, for the truth of which we pledge a faith yet unsullied by falsehood. The committee's like, dude, little purple in the argument there. Let's just say, to prove this, submitted to a candid world. Another example, not quite as much, he suffered the administration of justice, totally deceased in some of these states, refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. Now it's just he's obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent. Just gets to the point, right? So those are some of the changes that are made. This is one you can really see. This is back to where Adams had said to Jefferson, dude, going a little overboard here on the whole tyrant thing. So that's this whole thing of here, what they said. They still use the word tyrant, but they kind of just limit it to, one little punch, boom, right? Shouldn't act that way. They're arguing the king is acting in a way that is inappropriate and improper for them. They'll make one more set of changes to the ending, which are important for us. As I told you, Franklin wanted to get rid of the word sacred because of fears of too much religion, but many men in the room were Christians. This is not a document to support or create a Christian nation. That's not the point of what they're trying to do. But they were wanting to kind of continue to lean in to this idea. We talked about this last year when we looked at my doctoral research about kind of where we are as a nation and kind of what's happened to us. They're trying to walk this fine line, as I told you back then, between this enlightened viewpoint of citizens working together, while at the same time their own belief of not only the laws of nature, but of nature's God, right? So here in the end, they will add in two phrases to kind of get to this idea of saying we still believe our Christian faith, for those of us who have it, which is the majority of us, matters. They'll insert the concept of appealing to the supreme judge of the world. Now, this was something that was used multiple times. It's not a hard reach for them to say we should add this. We'll read it when we get there at the end. I'll point it out to you. And then the final sentence where they have the whole part about giving our lives and our sacred honor and this kind of stuff, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. So supreme judge, providence, these are all like code words that they meant very intentionally for what they would have said for the Christian God. Now what's poor Tom doing this whole time? He is unhappy. He said at the end that they mangled the original text. He's going to hold that view for the rest of his life, that what was done was horrible. Most scholars, fans of Jefferson, people like me who don't like the man, think it's a much better, tighter document. It's again, concise, brings it down tight. The punches are still there from the point that they're trying to make. Franklin tried to make him feel better, told him a long story, so maybe he read it about, there was a guy who was going to have a store to make hats, and he had a sign, and it was a whole bunch of stuff, and eventually the sign keeps getting edited down to just the dude's name and a picture of a hat. So maybe shorter is better. But in the end, that's where we'll get there. So now we've arrived. And so we are going to dive right in, and I'm going to ask you to help me read. I'm not going to read it. You're going to read it. The Declaration of Independence. And you'll see again up here, when I hand you the mic, because the mic's come to you, if you go, oh, I don't want to read, just pass it to the next person. It's all good. At certain points, I may stop us to kind of make a point for us. But what I want to do for the rest of the time till the very end is just hear the words that were voted on July 2nd, finalized on the 2nd and 3rd relative to the final document that we have. And we're reading the edited final copy. Again, it's important to note Jefferson, first draftsman. Committee gets to its argument, kind of builds the sense, it sends that draft. But the thing we have written for us is written by the whole committee. It's written by everybody. So it's an important thing to kind of put us in that stretch. So, Mr. Madison, Phil, start us off.
When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another.
And to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them.
A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation.
Lights of war.
Oh, my bad. Hang on a second. What are they saying here? It becomes necessary. We're one people. This is important. We're dissolving political bands. That's a conversation about where is the standing. I would suggest there aren't bands to be dissolved, but that's the argument they're making from their position. They're leaning in, as I said to you before, that blendedness between like the Enlightenment concept and their Christian faith, kind of putting those two things together. And now the entire rest of the document is declaring the causes. That's what they're going to try to do. They're still going to preamble it here for a few minutes, but Again, you are best understanding the Declaration if you see this as a legal brief. So imagine maybe you know a lawyer's going to court, they're going to make their opening arguments, they're going to present their evidence. And so that's what's happening here. All right, here we go.
We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yes.
The opening claims that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it.
And to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form, as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness.
Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes.
And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed.
This is actually one of the most important lines, or lines I like the most in here. Because lots of times people will ask me about our government, about governments, about things going on. And the reality is the human in the normative state will put up with a lot. And so then the question becomes, when's the too far, right? And for individuals, there's different lines of that's too far, right? Which is why you have some people who may protest something and other people who are not protesting something. But this is a great reflection by the people in Philadelphia as they make this statement. So now then we have to understand, they're saying we've reached that red line. We've crossed over. But we're not doing this casually. We're saying there's a whole bunch of reasons and things that have gone on, and we suffered it as long as we can. All right, here we go.
But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism.
This is also one of the most important lines, because we then have to find out for sure, can you prove that there are abuses? Abuses meaning things done to us. Usurpations meaning things that we believe were germane to us as a civic society taken away from us. You've usurped our natural power kind of stuff, right? And absolute despotism. So is there actually a design? That's one of the key arguments that they're going to try to make.
It is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security.
Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former system of government.
The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states.
So now this is interesting for us, because if you go back even to 75, you will read very few people blaming the King of Great Britain. So now they've made a shift. When we talked in January about the writings of Thomas Paine, when Professor Zimmer was here, right? This is one of the key things of what's happening with Thomas Paine's writing in Common Sense, is he's claiming monarchy itself is a bad form of government, and beyond that, this specific king is a bad monarch. Nobody had gone there yet, but between January and July, now they've gone there. And so it's interesting, this whole argument then will continue to be one about the king himself. Just read the first part.
To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world.
All right, so all of this, all these parts here, is your opening claims of where they're trying to go. So we said here that we have long train of abuses and usurpations. It's therefore the right duty to throw off this government, and this has been us, the patient sufferance of these colonies, And so now it's necessity which constrains us to alter the forms, systems of government, right? And then the why, the history of the King of Great Britain. So they're going to make this argument saying the king himself. And so now, to prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. Now this is why I've said many times before, when you read the Declaration in whole, you got this opening third of this argument. And then the latter 2/3 is the legal brief. It's all lawyerly, making claim. So we're going to kind of walk our way through. There's 3 large groups of charges. I'll point them out to you when we go. As I stated earlier, you can see then one reason, I don't think it's the only reason, one reason why they make this shift in 76 that they did not make in 75. You go back and read the 1765 Declaration of Rights from the Stamp Act. They are proclaiming their loyalty to the king because they're believing him to be a good monarch, and they're mad at Parliament. They're mad at Parliament all the way through 74, 75, and they make this shift. One reason why it seems most likely is that the loyalists have not been quiet. There's been an ongoing sense of challenge between them and the loyalists. And so the loyalist claim would be, in the system that we exist in, which is, even though it's England's constitutional, it's constitutional monarchy. And monarchy is established, they would have argued, from God, even if they weren't going to divine right of kings, because they weren't. And because it's a monarchy, you then owe your allegiance to the system and to the sovereign in particular. So no matter how mad you are, you can't do what you're doing without being like an evil person. You know, you're doing something that no other nation will stand with you. And remember, who are the facts being given to? To the world. They're not writing the Declaration of Independence to themselves. They are writing it to England, but they're not really writing it to England. You could almost say they're writing it to France. But they're writing it to the world because they want the world to go, oh, I see what you're saying. You're allowed to cut off yourselves from the king without, you're not doing direct harm to him like they did in 1642, or like France will do in another decade or so. So we're not going that far, but you're cutting off the system. And they're trying to say, we have a right to do this, not because we're mad, but because he's become a tyrant. Therefore, arguably, he's no longer in alignment with God, and we can step out from underneath his umbrella of sovereignty, and you should see it from our point of view that we're good. We're the good guys in the story. All right? Does that make sense for everybody? Kind of where they're going. Most of these, when you look at, they're untenable logically or in a historical chronology. We're going to walk through them. So we're ready to go. I don't know who has the mic, but this is the first one. So this is a series of he has.
He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good.
This is basically the idea that the king is supposed to be giving assent. He's not typically giving assent, and there's no real evidence that there were any laws specifically that he had come against them. But from their point of view, things they tried to do, they're probably thinking back also to the Currency Act, when Parliament denied the colonies from kind of creating their own money.
He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them.
So this is the idea that the different royal governors, Virginians are thinking about this as they thought about the change to Lord Dunmore. In Boston, the Massachusetts people are thinking about it relative to Governor Hutchinson, and they're seeing that those guys were using more of their agency to deny laws, and I don't like that. I don't think he should be allowed to do that. So those are his governors.
He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only.
You know the concept of gerrymandering? we know it. It's really a 19th century term relative to the United States, so this predates that. But they're basically accusing him of somehow doing something like that. There's no real evidence that he ever did anything like that from a sense of saying, hey, this is where a city should be or this is where a city shouldn't be. There's some moments when he was trying to defend rights of immigrants coming in who were from the opinion of Parliament, were not really given as much agency in the setting that they were in. But there's no smoking gun bullet that we could say, yeah, there, he did that kind of a thing to them. But they're looking and wondering, again, most of these things, when they say he has, you need to think, oh, that was the Parliament.
He has called together the
legislative
bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures.
This is basically us saying, hey, you're claiming Parliament's in charge. And so it'd be a long way to go on a boat to England. And it's, in one sense, it's like, okay, yes, that's true, but nobody's really asking you to go to England. So they're trying to make this argument that we should have had we do have governing rights here.
He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness in his invasions of the rights of the people.
Read these two together, so read this next one.
He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers incapable of annihilation have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within.
So they're basically saying, look, the governors were dissolving the legislatures, the local state legislatures. Again, the king never did any of that. And then once they had done that, they didn't allow new elections. Now, at this point, the former Massachusetts governor, Hutchinson, is in London. When they got a copy of the Declaration, Hutchinson was one of a few people in England who wrote basically a refutation. He's like, yeah, this is wrong, here's why, here's why, here's why, here's why. So you can read and find these writings from these people to have said, here's why the Declaration of Independence, particularly in its charges, are all incorrect. They're false charges, right? So in this one, Hutchinson noted, well, of course we dissolved them. You were forming rebellions. So it was the only way we thought we could stop you from doing rebellion. Of course, if that were correct, I think it's fair to say that. It didn't work because, as we noted when we looked at Jefferson, the Virginians, and most of the other places that had their legislatures dissolved, just began meeting in secret because they were determined to, as he says here, we were going to basically, the power of it goes to the people, so we were going to do it anyway. But he's arguing you should have never dissolved a representative body. So that's kind of the argument that we're making.
He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose, obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands.
This is three things. This last part, this is the 1763 proclamation line, saying you can't go where we just fought the French in the French and Indian War. You can't go out there, right? That's kind of the argument. You know how in all of our lifetimes, and those of you who are alive with me in the 60s and 70s, we've been arguing about immigration. We were arguing about immigration here. But we're basically accusing him of stopping immigration. There were some moments when Parliament had sought to limit the number of people moving over. That's fair. And so they're like, you can't do that. We don't like that you've done that. But there's that ongoing argument about immigration. All right, next one.
He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers.
This one's really, it's two things. One, we're going to see multiple times here. John Adams was the first to say there are things happening, certainly by the 1770s, that are shifting where the laws within the judicial system sit. And so he was calling out, this is troubling if they're going to remove the Judicial Act away from us, because in our Bill of Rights, as good British citizens, the right to a jury trial is right there. So you can't do that. Of course, you technically can. We do it even today at different times, say that's not going to be a jury trial for one reason or another within our jurisprudence as a nation. So that's kind of what's happening. But they're going to be having this debate about smuggling in particular, and the fear of the Parliament again, not the king, in saying, we don't know that we can trust the Americans to put forth a neutral jury when we're going to be having one of their own citizens on trial for smuggling. And of course, the smuggling conversation is, not our purpose now, but again, one of the ways, it's a good example of the thing that I've tried to say multiple times, in that when you look at the road to the revolution, what you're looking at is two groups of people having divergent ways of understanding a singular event. And a neutral judge, or us sitting in 2026, we can look back and say, oh, okay, I see this, and they're right, however you want to look at it. As you know, you've been on HOAs, you've been in the middle of things within your business, you've had situations within your family. At the moment, we're all blind. We can only see how furious we are and how dumb the other person is. And we kind of say things and act out and hold our positions. Or like I tell my students, we come holding our opinions tightly. And it takes a very broad-minded person to begin to hold their opinions loosely to engage conversation. That's just true for all of us. But so that's what you're getting here. And so smuggling, or as Hancock would have said, I'm just a businessman. I'm just got to pay for my boat. I'm just going to get some sugar. So that's all perspective. But that's kind of what's being argued here. There's no real evidence that the king, or Parliament for that matter, had ever actually rescinded the assent to laws by the administration of justice. Even going back to King George I, there's no record of the king opposing the laws within Parliament. And King George III certainly didn't. George is really the preeminent example of what we would call, when we look at European history, an enlightened monarch. Now, there's a whole longer conversation to go down that road for that. But when you look within the British system, they would have called it monarchy in Parliament. It meant that you were bound by whatever Parliament wanted to do. Of course, King George I, he didn't speak English. That's where we get the prime minister system from. Guy couldn't speak English, so we had to get somebody to help him. So they got the best minister, they got the leading minister, they got the first minister, prime. So we got the prime minister, Robert Walpole, who basically could speak German and tell him what's going on. And he's like, whatever you want to do. And so by the time you get to George III, who was raised then in England, spoke fluent English as well as German, he knew the system. I don't have any power to tell these people what to do, not really. So I'm not going to go and try to use power in a way that I know legally I cannot. We'll come back to that in a minute.
He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries.
So this question of who's paying really goes beyond the judges. It kind of rolls into, as you roll through, say, the 60s and into the 70s, you get this question of who should pay for the royal governors. And so obviously you can understand the feeling, probably from both sides, if someone is holding the purse strings on someone's job, then that person might be complicit in whether or not they're going to do their job well or do their job independently. So that's obviously part of the argument here.
He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass other people and eat out of their substance.
That just actually didn't happen at all. They're really probably looking mostly at the Admiralty Court, so we started to send some new judges over, but there weren't really new officers that were like taking over and governing. You did have new royal governors, so Dunmore was a new governor, Hutchinson took over in Massachusetts as an example. So you do have some of that happening. And again, the question of who's paying for it.
He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures.
So this is the one that's most hypocritical, because you have to go back in the story, which we did when we looked at the Road to Revolution. Why were the British troops in North America? Anybody want to shout out an answer? French and Indian War. Why were they there in the French and Indian War? They don't show it in the movie on Washington, you've got to see it. Because for the previous 3 wars, the colonists had begged the Parliament, send us an army. We're being attacked by the French. They have professional armies here. We're just fighting with our little militias. Send us help. And so they do. They finally do. It doesn't go well. We don't win the French and Indian War as British because of anything happening in the colonies. We kind of bumble our way through it. It's all because of what Pitt does in beefing up the Navy and taking out French support in India and other places. But that's a different conversation. But then when they were left behind, we're like, we're so glad you're here. Now go home. Which we can say that. That's fair to say. But in other words, they're there because we ask for them to be there.
He is effected to render the military independent of superior to the civil power.
Okay, so this is probably talking most about the fact that coming out of the course of Acts, Boston, Massachusetts lost its charter. That's one of the earlier things it was talking about, charters and stuff. They lost their charter in punishment for the acts of rebellion, and the governor was put in charge, was a military governor. So Thomas Gage, who again, if you saw the movie on Washington, he's in the movie because he fought with Washington, the Battle of Monongahela. He was there, right? So Washington, I would love to, I've not seen anything that suggests that when Washington gets to Boston in 75, that he sent a note to Thomas and go, hey dude, what's up? Good to see you. You're in a pickle down there in Boston. I don't know if they had any back and forth or not, if they had any previous interactions. But this is basically talking about that more than anything else. So we're going to pause for a second, because that's the end of section 1. So sections 1 to 12, you get them all. You go, he has, he has, he has, he has. It's the he has section that they're getting to. And they're all basically things that the king or parliament really had done to try to check the tide of rebellion that when you begin to see in 61 through 76, 75. Right? So they're kind of marking these things out. Obviously, from an American point of view, they feel tyrannical. They feel limiting. When you look at the whole story, maybe you come to a different conclusion. Obviously, the British view is, you guys are burning people's houses down. What do you think we're supposed to do with that? So there's that back and forth that we've talked about before. The question to ask, again, is this the action of the tyrant? Basically, we talked about. I will remind you, the simplest way to understand the American Revolution is that it is a question of control. Who's in control? And we, certainly by 73, and for some, like Sam Adams, Patrick Henry, 70, 68, they're like, we should be in control. We here, we should be in control. And this is why Ben Franklin was trying to convince England to set up what we could basically see as an example of the Commonwealth system, where the Americans in that example would have had their own parliament, had their own prime minister, loyal to the king. And had anybody else been as far visionary as Ben Franklin, we would not have had a war. We would not have had a revolution. And we would have had a story similar to the one Canada had in their journey. But again, nobody could see that except for Franklin. So they're trying to make the argument. Now, so then at 12, they're going to add one more he has, and then notice they'll get like a little colon at the end. And they're going to make an argument about a whole series of things Parliament has done. But notice how they're going to say it. So let's read it first.
He is combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts, pretended legislation.
All right, so here's his colon. So now, what are the pretended legislation? We're going to get this, but I want you to see, what do they not say? What word's not on there? Parliament. Parliament should be on there. Parliament's done everything. Again, just go read all the arguments and complaints from 63. The first thing we really write is in 65, like officially, so read from the Declaration of Rights in 65, all the way through 75. Parliament's the problem. And now they realize we're going to have to throw the blame on the king. So we're not even going to use Parliament's word. We're going to use others, those other people. And now notice this also. Jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution. Well, we don't have a Constitution. So it's a little early to be making that claim. And so then they're going to say, so what are these acts of pretended legislation? Ready?
For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us.
Now this is really talking about since 73 and the what we would have called the intolerable acts, the coercive acts. But it's important to recognize, if you do this study, which we've done here, there's quartering acts from the time the war ends in 63, and nobody complains. Nobody's complaining, nobody's complaining. 73, somebody starts complaining. So it's an interesting thing of looking at the movement among the Americans as their thoughts and opinions relative. Again, I know none of you want to give up your house, but if for some reason, most of us, not all of you, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but most of us, if you had a chance to do something that helps, like if a group of our soldiers were marching through here and they needed a place to stay, so I take two, I got a bedroom, come on in. We didn't complain, we fix some breakfast the next morning, good luck, be safe, thanks for protecting us, right? Most of us would do something like that, right? It's okay if you wouldn't, that's fine. But you get the picture, right? Nobody was unhappy. But if you were in Virginia in 1862, and the soldiers came marching through of your country, the one you would have allegianced yourself to just 2 years before, you're probably going to have a different opinion. Right? Can you see it? Can you see how the feelings change? All right. He's done the quartering.
For protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states.
This is the one that I'm the most curious about. Anybody come up with what's the most famous trial about punishment for murders? Boston Massacre. Remember, only one of those words is true. It did happen in Boston. And famously, what did we do? We had, at that time, I'd say a moderate patriot, but we had a patriot, John Adams, willingly take on the defense of them. So in my head, I'm wondering what John was thinking when he read that. Did he think, how dare you? Or there's no other trials that I'm really aware of in which there's accusations against soldiers. There will be soldiers murdering citizens in the act of war, and in some cases just the act of brutality, later. They might have been thinking about Lexington and Concord, but Lexington and Concord would be definitely, if they wanted to call it murders, but there was no trial related to that. So it's one of the most interesting things for them to put there and for John to just let it slide. There's nothing that he wrote down that I've ever read that's like his opinion about the process. But, next one.
For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world.
Now, of course, they do that with the Prohibitory Act. So that's in 1775, and we find out about it in 76. But the Parliament's been controlling trade around the world since the 1600s. So it's not really fair to somehow suggest that this is a new thing.
For imposing taxes on us without our consent.
No taxation without representation, 1765, that whole thing relative to the Stamp Act.
For depriving us in many cases of the benefits of a trial.
Trial by jury, so it goes back to the idea of what's in the Bill of Rights. Remember I say Bill of Rights, I'm talking about our government, Great Britain, English Bill of Rights, that's our Bill of Rights, right? Very clearly says that. And one of the things, as I noted already for you, John Adams was quick on the trigger, one of the first, maybe not the first, to say, hey, whoa, now we are starting to see some examples of potential, not tyranny, we're definitely straying far away from our rights as citizens when you're not going to give us a jury trial. Again, from the British point of view, hopefully you see the picture. Can we trust a jury of all those people? Probably not. So it's that back and forth that would be going in the process. Next.
For transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses.
This is the idea of the Admiralty courts. They weren't really overseas. I mean, the way they make it sound is like they're being taken back to London. So there's nobody that I know of being taken back to London for trials. They were being taken like to places far away, up to Canada, so they often were taken by boat, say from Charlestown, or from down in Virginia and taken up to an Admiralty court, somewhere up in the far eastern side of modern Canada. So that's certainly true. But again, it's this idea of where is justice being held? Is it held within the local citizenry or not?
For abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighbouring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies.
So this is about the Quebec Act. So we fight the French Indian War, we conquer what you and I would call Canada, but it's the province of Quebec, right? What do they speak in Quebec today? French. Why the Quebec Act of 1774? Because up to that point, we hadn't really said much because of all the things happening with us, but if you'd just said to England, what's going to happen to Quebec? Well, they're going to become good British citizens. They'll speak English, the end. And then all of a sudden, with all the turmoil happening, they're like, well, the last thing we want is more problems with this recently conquered people. So how can we have them not be angry at us? We'll let them speak French. We'll let them keep the French system of jurisprudence. So basically, you can still pretend to be French even though we conquered you. Just don't join the Americans. This is why when Ben Franklin shows up in early 76, the Army had already tried it under Benedict Arnold, but when Franklin shows up, he gets no takers. They're not interested in becoming the 14th colony with us because they arguably could say, we don't know if you're going to win, and we've already gotten what we want. So we're pretty happy in the process. So they're making this argument. And then you can see they're basically saying he bought them off, which, yes, that's exactly what happened. Parliament absolutely bought off Quebec so that they would not join. And so we're making the argument he's going to try to do that with us. Fair enough. That's a fair argument to make.
For taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our government.
And again, this is really talking about Massachusetts. That's the basic focus there. Next.
For suspending our own legislatures in declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases, whatever.
So if you go back to the Stamp Act, we burn houses down, we complain, we get frustrated, and they change it. They take it away. But in the same parliamentary session, they then also passed what was called the Declaratory Act, declaring. And so we're not tipping back to that. We're like, yeah, you guys declared yourselves the supreme government, which in 1765, Parliament absolutely did that. They're like, yes, because we are the government. We're the government of these, fill in the blank. These lands of Great Britain. We are the government. At the time of doing it, it was seen as an unwise thing. When this one was read in England, everybody kind of looked at those politicians and go, yeah, thanks a lot. Because it wasn't, they would have argued an unnecessary step. To Parliament, it was necessary because they were rescinding this tax that they thought was fair and balanced and had been approved by Americans, so it shouldn't have been a problem. Now we're backing down, but we want to kind of put our foot down, but don't you do it again, kind of a thing, but now it's come back to haunt them. All right, so this middle section is all about the king's support of Parliament. So 13 leads us in, 14 to 22 kind of walks through Parliament, coming out of that colon, that was the end of 13. And again, I would say for all of these, they are true, except there's a couple I pointed out to you. They're true in the sense that they did happen. And again, then takes us back to the perspective aspect of who we're going to kind of follow in on the process. And again, not trying to overly defend George III, but just to point out for you, for George III to have done the things that we were accusing him having done, he would have indeed had to become a tyrant, willing to break with the Constitution. So he was unwilling to break with the Constitution, thereby telling Parliament, you must do this, 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 and this. And he was consistently bound by the decisions of Parliament. Now, I'm not suggesting he disagreed with those decisions. I think he agreed with the decisions. Hence his argument or his speech in October of 75, saying, look, the colonies are in open and avowed rebellion, and now we have to do something about it. We have to step in. He would have said, we have patiently tried for over a decade to get these few hotheads to, back down, to see the light of day, to realize that they're reaching too far. Again, that's the British perspective in the story, right? But when you look at the life of King George III, particularly at this moment, you see a moderate who's wishing he could do more, but knowing that he doesn't have the agency to do more because he is choosing to stay bound within the laws and rules of the Constitution. Or they didn't have a written Constitution, but their understanding of the ideas coming out of the 1687, 88, 89 crisis of the Glorious Revolution. Right, so the last section now shifts to the actions that have happened in just the past year about war. They'll go back to he has. So the last one's reading. We're not done. We have to do the closing. So we'll keep going up the hill there.
He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us.
So this is basically looking at the Prohibitory Act, which is saying, hey, if you read the King's speech, he says, this is happening so that I can protect you. Again, the perspective issue, right? He's obviously, Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, waging war. The question one might ask is the why.
He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation.
So this is where you definitely get some hyperbole going here. Right? You definitely reached over some lines in the process. I will remind you the House of Hanover is of Hanover, right? So that's in Central Europe. This is before a place called Germany exists, but he's from the House of Hanover. So yes, as it became necessary for more troops, he reached back to his cousins and said, need a little help. First thing they did is they sent German troops to Minorca and to Gibraltar, so you could free those British troops to go and try to help out. But eventually, by the time you get to 76, it's not enough troops. Gage, who had been in Boston, had already told London, look, we probably need 50,000 troops. 50,000 troops was not something England had. Great Britain did not have the capacity to pull that off. It'd be like if something was happening in our world today for our army, and they're like, we could do it if we had 1 million soldiers. Well, there's 350 million of us, so we could get 1 million soldiers, but we don't just have 1 million soldiers, right? You see the problem there? And then they think about how complicated and frustrating it would be for people if all of a sudden there was some sort of a draft to get us to 1 million soldiers. 50,000 troops, Gage, you've lost your mind. But now, a year later, they're like, oh, we see what you mean. We don't have 50,000 troops, how do we get them? So we're going to have to go get some help in the process. Whoever's next on the microphone.
He has constrained our fellow citizens, taken captive on the high seas, to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands.
The idea of impressment, you probably know that word related to the War of 1812. It's happening here, coming out of the Prohibitory Act.
He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontier the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions.
So this is obviously a very racist way of saying things, so we're all clear on that. Thank you for being willing to read it. It should bear note that we invite the Native Americans to help us, and they fought alongside us, so a little bit of hypocrisy there if we're going to make that statement and then include them in our efforts to win militarily. The first part is really probably looking at Dunmore, Governor Dunmore in Virginia, who had already passed his resolution saying if any current enslaved peoples wish to fight with the British Army, they will be granted their freedom. We'll look at all that when Professor Solomon comes and kind of walks us through what's going on for the enslaved people in the time of the Revolution. But so that's what this is going on. So these right here, I'm going to go back real quick. These right here, these are all, every one of these are about the war now. So arguably, yes, these are all done. Why were they done? Because the revolution has exploded. So you don't have to like them, but it's kind of hard to say they're the reasons for the revolution because they're actually responses to the revolution, right? So they kind of fall on a little deaf ears there in the process. But they work. The propaganda works. And so I'm going to go to this slide and come back. Oh, sorry, I'll get over here, I promise. Oh, fiddlesticks. This big, oh my goodness, where is the picture I want? Oh, I already did it. The other direction, Carl, other direction. That picture. This is in New York. When George Washington reads this in New York on July 9th, the troops march down Broadway, pull down this statue of the king. They decapitate the head, just a statue, and then they melt the whole thing down to make ammunition and weapons and bullets and stuff, right? The king is a tyrant. He's against us. We're freedom-loving people. We've done all these things, and now they're trying to hold us back, right? Most of them, except maybe the ones about the judges or this one about suspending colonial legislatures, they're not fair logically in the sense of that should not have happened like constitutionally or such. But the overall messaging has worked. So now they're going to bring it in for a closing. So with the microphone, keep going. Whoever's got it next, please read on.
In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury.
A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people.
Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us.
We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here.
We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence.
They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and
consanguinity.
Consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends.
Throwing down, right, on our British brothers. Sorry, Michael. Consanguinity, we are blood together. So we're relatives together. This was actually the more moderate version. When you read the committee's version, it's even a little more hyperbolic and kind of going in for the kill, saying, hey, you British citizens, you have failed us, we are your brothers and sisters. So now they move it into the conclusion.
We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions.
So here's that appealing to the Supreme Judge. This is added in by the committee.
Do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be free and independent states.
That they are absolved from the allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connections between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved.
And that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contact alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do.
And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
Ta-da! You did it. Give us a round of applause. Yes. You read all the way through. Maybe for some of you, you did that just this past week on July 4th, and maybe for some of you, it's the first time you've read all the way through it. So, on the 4th, there was one last perfunctory vote. It's a vote that you just do when you finish working through the committee of the whole. So it's necessary, but it's still, they'd already taken the vote that mattered. New York still abstained. They said, hey, we're good, we're going to be with you. It's printed in the 6th. It's read publicly with celebration, a little fireworks action on the 8th. So we could have chosen July 8th if we wanted to just follow along with our tradition. Then it got sent out. Well, really got sent out on the 6th. It gets to New York on the 9th. General Washington calls his troops into assembly, has it read to them in the process, and there's a lot of cheering involved, and like I said, then they go marching down the street and tear down the statue because we need the bullets anyway. And so the process gets around. Abigail, I think she hears it on the 14th. The 14th she gets John, sends her a letter. And so she writes back, and she writes, I'm gratified when I reflect that he, John, has had the honor of being a principal actor in laying a foundation for our country's future greatness. And on the 18th, it's read out loud in Boston. So they didn't get there before that. She happens to be there with her cousin, and they were going for doctor visits, dealing with smallpox, and they're like, oh, they're going to read the Declaration. Oh, I want to go hear it. So they read it out loud. So they used to read it aloud all the time, which is kind of cool, actually, quite honestly, in the process. So what does it mean for you and me? We stand here in 2026, 250 years later. We are an extraordinarily young nation. Hopefully you know that. And yet there has been a great reach. One of the points that I've tried to make, not today, but other places, when we say these things are self-evident, they would have been self-evident to nobody at that time except British people. The British people would have read it and said, yeah, we understand this. We said this 100 years ago. But everybody else was kind of like, I've never heard this before. And so it's interesting to kind of look at its long legacy for us. It gets lost for many because today in 2026, aren't there like 190 nations in the UN or something like that? Almost all of them have some version of citizen representative government. You and I might look at a few of them and say, your citizens don't have any voice, but they will say that they do. Meaning what? They've all copied us. That's where it's all come from. They weren't copying anybody beforehand, they copied us. For good or bad. And again, we can argue about how well we think it's been done by these other countries and all that kind of stuff. That's not the point. The point is that I want you as a citizen to be able to go, wow, this was our thing. I mean, we said this out loud. Again, it was known in England. It was known in the British Isles. It was understood, and again, we were making our arguments as British citizens. But at that point, it hadn't gone anywhere else. As I said when we did the French Revolution, you do not have a French Revolution without the Declaration of Independence. You just simply don't, both for the military expenditure and the cost that came to Louis XVI's government, and the fact that he's got French soldiers going back with the ideas of the Declaration in their head, if not actual copies of this thing, coming back. Lafayette's the most famous example, but still you've got the sense of them saying, hey, wait a minute, government should be from the consent of the governed. It's not like people knew that and had experienced that. They had not. Now, they still got to get the governing documents. We're already going to look at these later this year. Here, they finish them in November of '77. And then they still got to be defended on the battlefield. It's another reason why we're going to have more sessions later this year. I think one of the things that's most important for us to spend time on or think about as we're closing up here is that this idea, as Jefferson called an expression of the American mind, which, as I've already alluded to, would be a better stated expression of the British and American mind, because we got it from them. It's this concept that the individual human has agency due to having worth. Why do you have worth? Why should each of you get a chance to vote? Because you're breathing. That's the reason. Not because the government says you can vote. You get to vote, you get to participate, we argue, because you're alive. Again, we're borrowing all that from the Scottish Enlightenment writers, and you can even go back to Hobbes, and you see it in Hobbes, this idea of a social contract. He's really the first to say it, not Locke. And so this idea that we collectively, but why? Because, to use our phrase, the laws of nature, you want to lean on the Enlightenment side, and of nature's God, you want to lean on the Christian side. Either way you want to lean, there it is. You're breathing, you get these rights. And this is something that literally hadn't been stated. This idea of all men created equal. So when you read this, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And I get it, ladies. There could be an argument. Do they mean men, or do they mean men humans? And you can have your own debate. And yes, the ladies were not afforded the right to vote for a while. And yes, it is a great crime that there was slavery in all 13 states at that point, not just the South. And yes, the Native Americans, it was their land to begin with. You can say all those things, it's accurate and fair to say. And yet, this aspirational concept going forth is from what really all future revolutions, both civic and governance, as well as just ideological about rights and principles and suffrage, all of those come back to this. You don't have any of those revolutions occurring. Not like we were the 17th revolution in a series of revolutions from, say, the 1400s. There were no revolutions. The British Glorious Revolution, another 180, 90 years, then us. After us, it's like an avalanche of revolutions. People going, hey, yeah, maybe these things are self-evident. Maybe they are endowed by their creator. Not endowed by just nature, not endowed by just, science, endowed by who? Their creator. That's from the committee. That's not from the first group. With certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. John, later in life, wrote this: the radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people was to move from a monarchical, or what I call the power pyramid, or the normal state of government. Everybody in the world was in this kind of power pyramid with a few exclusive people on top governing the rest of us. And quite honestly, my folks are of peasant stock. Nobody cared what my family's thought when we lived. We either lived in Hanover, Hesse, or Saxony. Nobody cared what we thought. We're peasants. You don't matter. To all of a sudden, we're going to say everybody has a right to participate the consent of the governed. And so that is where we will end up with this great statement here, holding us up. Yes, some of you may go, wait, you're kind of critical of the legal arguments. Yes, I find most of them specious. I do not think that they hold water. But the point of the document that's worthy of our celebration 25 years later is not those statements, but the other statements that kind of set in motion a series of ideas that value each one of us, whatever color, creed, look, where you're from. You have these rights. You don't have these rights because you're an American. You have these rights because you're living, you're breathing, and down to us by our Creator. And that's why we celebrate on Independence Day. Thanks, everybody. Does anybody want to ask me a question in the few minutes we have left? It's okay if you don't. If you need to leave, by all means. Thank you so much. Here's the next ones. We'll leave this up here for a second. Again, you get all this in the library. Our library is amazing. Come participate in all the wonderful things that they do. And then once I see you taking some pictures of what's coming up next, then I will also put up a way how you can get to me either by email or you can find other lectures that we've had here and other places that I'm privileged to give them if you would like to join them and see them with the QR code. We'd like to have you come back. It's a lot of fun. Appreciate you guys. I'll be here if you want to ask me personally any questions.